The world we inhabit is held together by invisible lines, cables beneath the ocean, flight paths in the stratosphere, and digital signals pulsing through the air. But long before the age of silicon, the world was bound by a single, organic fiber, silk. It was a thread so delicate it could be snapped by a child, yet so strong it pulled armies across continents, emptied the treasuries of empires, and redefined the meaning of human luxury. To the ancients, it was a mystery born of a moth and a tree, a secret guarded by the threat of death and a currency that shimmered in the light. Welcome to the wealth thread. To find the origin of the wealth thread, we must look back nearly 5,000 years, past the shadow of the Great Wall and the buried terracotta armies, to a time when China was a patchwork of Neolithic cultures huddled along the life-giving silt of the Yellow River. History often begins with the clash of bronze or the roar of conquest, but the history of silk begins with a soft, accidental splash in a garden of perfect silence. The year is traditionally cited as 2640 BCE, a date so deep in the well of time that history and myth are indistinguishable. The setting is the lush, private gardens of the Xia dynasty's imperial palace. According to legend, the Empress Leizu, wife of the mythical Yellow Emperor, was sitting beneath the dappled, emerald shade of a white mulberry tree. The air would have been heavy, humid, and thick with the scent of damp earth and ripening fruit. She was enjoying a cup of hot tea, the steam rising in thin, translucent ribbons, when a small, hard, white object fell from the branches above and landed directly in her steaming brew. Most would have discarded the cup as ruined. But as the Empress watched, the heat of the water began to act upon the object, dissolving the sticky natural glue, a protein called sericin, that held it together. This was the first industrial revolution of the textile world, happening in a teacup. Slowly, a shimmering, thin hair began to unravel. Leizu reached into the water and pulled. To her amazement, the thread didn't end. She began to wrap it around her finger, marveling at its strength, its pearlescent luster, and its incredible length. A single cocoon, she realized, contained a continuous strand of nearly 1,000 yards. In the silence of that garden, Leizu was witnessing the birth of a biological monopoly. But the wealth of this thread was not just in its beauty, it was in its scarcity. She looked up into the tree and found the architect, the Bombyx mori. She realized that if these creatures could be domesticated, and if their cocoons could be harvested before the moths emerged and broke the fibers, humanity would possess a fabric unlike any other. This discovery was essentially the discovery of a new form of soft gold. As Leizu refined the process, she invented the tools that would define the industry for 5 millennia. She created the boiling vats to soften the cocoons and the first primitive reeling frames to draw the silk onto spools. She realized that by twisting several of these microscopic filaments together, she could create a thread that was stronger than a similar strand of iron, yet soft enough to flow like water. This was the birth of the liquid gold, and its value was established almost immediately as an elite asset class. In these early centuries, silk was not a trade good, it was a sacred imperial prerogative. But as the technique spread, silk became the literal currency of the East. To understand the wealth involved, we must look at the Han Dynasty ledgers. A single bolt of silk, standardized at about 12 meters long, became a fixed unit of value, as stable as any gold bar. At the height of the Silk Road's early influence, a single bolt of high-quality silk was worth approximately 9,000 to 12,000 copper cash, or roughly 1 year's wages for a common worker. In the markets of the distant West, that same bolt could be exchanged for half a pound of gold. In the military outposts of the Gobi Desert, silk was more reliable than metal coins. One bolt could buy 1 head of cattle, or several months' worth of grain for an entire garrison of soldiers. If a provincial governor wanted to pay his taxes to the emperor, he did not send chests of coins, he sent wagons of silk. The opportunity cost of this wealth was immense. Every acre of land dedicated to mulberry trees was an acre that could not produce rice or millet. China was effectively choosing to grow its wealth rather than its food. This created a high-risk, high-reward economy where a single frost or a blight on the mulberry leaves could cause a financial collapse equivalent to a modern market crash. To the Chinese, silk was more than a textile, it was an extension of the soul of the empire. They developed specialized dyes from cinnabar and malachite, creating robes that looked like trapped sunlight. They realized very early on that they held a secret that the rest of the world would eventually kill for. By the time the first caravans began to eye the western horizons, the wealth thread was already the most powerful financial instrument in the world. The Empress's tea had cooled long ago, but the thread she pulled from that cup was now long enough to stretch across the known world, waiting for the first brave merchants to follow it into the unknown. To the uninitiated, the production of silk sounds like a pastoral dream, a simple harvest akin to picking cotton or shearing sheep. But the reality of ancient Chinese sericulture was an exercise in extreme biological control, a form of high-stakes engineering where the machine was a living creature. The Bombyx mori, or the domestic silk moth, is perhaps the most enslaved organism in human history. Over 5,000 years of human selection, it has become a biological ghost. It can no longer fly, it cannot see, and it cannot survive for more than a few days in the wild without a human hand to feed it. It exists for one purpose only, to serve the thread. The cycle of wealth begins with the eggs, tiny, pepper-like specks that were, for millennia, more valuable than the land they sat upon. In ancient China, the hatching of these eggs had to be perfectly synchronized with the first budding of the white mulberry trees. This required a level of thermal management that seems impossible for a pre-industrial society. To ensure the eggs hatched at the exact moment the food supply was ready, women would often carry the eggs in small, silk pouches against their bare skin, using their own body heat to incubate the life within. It was an intimate, visceral connection between the worker and the capital. If the woman grew too cold, the harvest died. If she grew too feverish, the eggs hatched too early, and the larvae starved. When the larvae emerge, they are ravenous, and the wealth thread enters its most expensive phase. For the next 30 days, the silkworm does nothing but eat. But it is a picky eater. It will only consume the fresh, hand-picked, and perfectly dry leaves of the Morus alba. To produce the liquid gold, the diet must be immaculate. If the leaves are slightly damp from dew, the worm develops a fatal rot. If they are too old, the silk loses its luster. At the peak of the growing season, a single room of silkworms creates a sound that travelers described as a torrential rainstorm, the collective, rhythmic clicking of millions of tiny mandibles devouring green leaves. This sound was the literal heartbeat of the Chinese economy. The labor required during this silk moon is staggering. The worms must be fed every few hours, day and night. Their wooden trays must be cleaned of waste constantly, as any bacteria can wipe out an entire year's wealth in a single afternoon. This is why the Chinese developed such a strict code of conduct around the rearing rooms. It wasn't just superstition, it was high-level biosecurity. No strong perfumes, no shouting, no sudden movements, and no smoke. The silkworm demands a sanctuary of silence. In modern terms, the overhead of this factory was immense. The cost of labor alone made silk a luxury that 99% of the global population could never hope to touch. Then comes the miracle of transmutation. Once the worm has increased its weight 10,000-fold, it stops eating. It raises its head and begins to swing it in a rhythmic figure eight. From two specialized glands in its body, it secretes a liquid protein that hardens the moment it touches the air. This is fibroin. Simultaneously, it secretes sericin, a natural gum that bonds the fibers together. For 3 days, without pause, the worm spins. It creates a protective vault, a cocoon, made of a single, unbroken thread that can stretch for nearly a mile. This is the point where the wealth thread faces its most brutal paradox. If the moth is allowed to complete its transformation and emerge from the cocoon, it will secrete an enzyme that dissolves the silk, breaking the long, continuous strand into thousands of useless fragments. To save the wealth, the life must be sacrificed. The cocoons are gathered and subjected to intense heat, either by steam or the scorching sun, to kill the pupae within. It was a calculated, synchronized death of billions of creatures to preserve a single, unbroken line of profit. What remains is a hard, white orb of potential. But to get to the silk, one must unravel it. The cocoons are dropped into vats of near-boiling water to dissolve the sericin glue. A worker, usually a woman with hands thickened and scarred by years of steam and heat, stirs the water with a bamboo brush, catching the microscopic ends of the fibers. She must find the lead of the thread. Once found, several of these invisible filaments are pulled together and wound onto a reel. The economic concentration in this process is difficult to fathom. It takes roughly 2,500 to 3,000 cocoons to produce just 1 pound of raw silk. In the markets of the Tang dynasty, that single pound of raw silk could be traded for its exact weight in silver, and by the time it reached the Roman Empire, it was traded for its exact weight in gold. If a Roman aristocrat purchased a ceremonial robe weighing 3 pounds, they were effectively paying the equivalent of $120,000 to $150,000 in modern purchasing power for a single garment. This was the secret the West could not solve. They could see the fabric, they could feel its weight, but they could not fathom that it came from a moth that had been domesticated into a living machine. They could not understand that the liquid gold was not mined from the earth, but engineered in a garden through 30 days of silence and a single moment of heat. For nearly 3,000 years, the most valuable secret on the planet was not a weapon or a map, but a biological process. The Chinese Empire understood a fundamental truth of economics long before the West, that a monopoly is not just about owning a product, it is about owning the source. To protect the liquid gold, the various dynasties of China constructed a wall far more impenetrable than the stone fortifications of the north. They built a wall of silence, enforced by the most brutal legal codes in the ancient world. In the eyes of the emperor, a silkworm egg was not just an insect, it was a strategic asset of the state, equivalent to a modern nuclear secret or a central bank's gold reserves. To export the eggs of the Bombyx mori, or even the seeds of the white mulberry tree, was classified as an act of high treason. The punishment was not mere imprisonment, it was the death of 1,000 cuts. Anyone caught attempting to smuggle the biological precursors of silk out of the country was executed publicly, and often their entire family was erased from the census to ensure the lineage of the betrayal ended there. This wasn't just cruelty, it was a calculated protection of a multi-billion-dollar GDP. This monopoly was maintained through a sophisticated system of internal checkpoints. Every caravan moving toward the western borders was subjected to invasive searches. Guards would dismantle wagons, sift through bags of grain, and inspect the linings of robes, looking for the tiny, pepper-like eggs that could fit by the thousands in the palm of a hand. The wealth thread was so vital to the stability of the Chinese economy that the state could not afford even a single leak. If the secret reached the West, the value of China's primary export would collapse, and with it, the power of the throne. The Silk Bureau acted as a shadow government, overseeing every aspect of production with iron-fisted precision. They dictated the exact number of mulberry trees a village could plant and the specific day the harvest must begin. No independent farmer could simply decide to enter the silk trade, it was a state-franchised industry. Inspectors would measure the tension and weight of finished bolts with specialized scales, ensuring that the brand of Chinese silk remained the gold standard of the world. A single substandard bolt could bring shame, and often a heavy fine or corporal punishment, to an entire weaving district. To understand the scale of this monopoly's worth, we must look at the trade imbalance it created. By the time of the Han Dynasty, China was effectively a black hole for global currency. They exported silk, but they required very little in return from the barbarian lands of the West. This meant that gold and silver flowed into China in a constant, glittering stream, never to return. In modern terms, China maintained a trade surplus that would be the envy of any 21st century superpower. At its peak, the Silk Road was a one-way street for wealth. Historians estimate that during the Roman era, the empire was losing approximately 100 million sesterces annually to the silk trade, a sum that represented nearly 10% of the entire Roman imperial budget. In today's value, that is equivalent to an annual wealth transfer of over $2 billion for a single fabric. The Romans were literally bankrupting themselves to wear the liquid gold that China grew in its backyard for the cost of a few mulberry leaves and the labor of peasants. This led to a silk crisis in Rome, where the Senate desperately tried to pass sumptuary laws to ban the fabric, claiming it was both financially ruinous and morally corrupting. But the monopoly wasn't just enforced by the sword, it was reinforced by mystery. The Chinese actively encouraged the wildest rumors about silk's origin. To the Roman historian Pliny the Elder, silk was a downy substance found on the leaves of trees in a land of the Circe. Others believed it was made from the soil or harvested from the bellies of giant desert spiders. By keeping the world ignorant of the moth, China ensured that no one else could even begin to replicate the process. They were selling a miracle, and you cannot put a price cap on a miracle. This blood price of the secret created a world of two tiers, those who knew how to weave the thread, and those who were willing to go bankrupt to buy it. For 3 millennia, the secret held. It survived the rise and fall of dynasties, the invasions of nomadic tribes, and the shifting of the very earth. But as the wealth thread grew longer, stretching toward the Mediterranean, the pressure on the monopoly became unbearable. The world was no longer content to buy the miracle, they wanted to own the machine. While the silkworm provided the raw material, the true genius of the wealth thread lay in the machines that processed it. To the outside world, a bolt of silk was a miracle of nature, but to the Chinese, it was a miracle of engineering. The development of the Chinese loom, specifically the complex draw loom, represented the pinnacle of ancient technology. If the silkworm was the hard drive of the industry, the loom was the processor, capable of executing intricate programs in thread that no other civilization could fathom. To understand the value of a finished piece of imperial silk, one must understand the sheer complexity of the loom of heaven. In the West, early weaving was done on simple vertical or horizontal frames, capable of producing plain, solid-colored fabrics. But the Chinese had mastered the art of pattern weaving or damask. This required a machine that could manage thousands of individual warp threads simultaneously. By the Han Dynasty, the Chinese draw loom had become so advanced that it required 2 operators, a weaver seated at the base and a drawboy perched high above in the frame. The drawboy's job was a physical manifestation of binary code. Following a complex pattern book, he would manually lift specific groups of threads so the weaver below could pass the shuttle through. This allowed for the creation of intricate floral designs, celestial dragons, and even philosophical inscriptions to be coded directly into the fabric. This wasn't just weaving, it was a form of early data storage. The pattern was the program, and the loom was the hardware. This complexity meant that a single high-quality robe could take months, or even years, to complete. The economic barrier to entry for this technology was massive. A top-tier draw loom was an expensive piece of capital equipment, often costing the equivalent of 5 to 10 years of a peasant's income. In modern terms, owning a high-end weaving workshop in ancient Chang'an was like owning a semiconductor fabrication plant today. You didn't just need the wood and the thread, you needed the specialized software knowledge of the pattern makers. This further reinforced the Chinese monopoly. Even if a spy managed to steal a silkworm, they would still lack the computers necessary to produce the complex pattern silks that the global elite demanded. Let's look at the monetary value of this mechanical labor. While raw silk was valuable, figured or patterned silk was in a different league entirely. A plain bolt of silk might be worth 1 year's wages, but a masterwork of imperial brocade, featuring gold-wrapped threads and complex religious motifs, could be valued at 10 or even 20 times that amount. In the luxury markets of the era, a single high-end garment could cost upwards of 100,000 copper cash. For context, that was enough money to purchase a small farm with all its livestock and equipment. The loom of heaven also introduced the concept of industrial standardization. The Silk Bureau mandated that looms across the empire adhere to specific widths and thread counts. This was the birth of interchangeable parts in the textile world. A bolt of silk from the south had to match a bolt of silk from the north, allowing them to be traded as a fungible commodity. This standardization is what allowed silk to become a wealth thread that could bridge the gap between different cultures. Whether you were a merchant in the Taklamakan desert or a priest in a mountain temple, you knew exactly what you were getting when you saw the imperial standard weave. Furthermore, the engineering of these looms pushed other technologies forward. The use of pedals to control the loom's action was the first time humans used their feet to perform complex mechanical tasks, a precursor to the treadles and pedals of the Industrial Revolution. The tensioning systems, the pulleys, and the delicate bamboo needles required a level of precision engineering that wouldn't be seen in Europe for another 1,000 years. This mechanical edge gave China a value-added advantage. They weren't just exporting a raw resource, they were exporting a high-tech finished product. To the kings and queens of the West, the patterns on Chinese silk were not just beautiful, they were impossible. They looked at the dragons and the clouds woven into the fabric and saw a technology that felt like magic. They couldn't understand how a human hand could manage so many threads at once without a mistake. In every thread of liquid gold, there was a hidden cost: the cost of the machine, the cost of the pattern maker's education, and the physical toll on the drawboy in the rafters. The loom of heaven was a silent engine of wealth, churning out the most sophisticated material on earth and ensuring that as long as China held the code, they would hold the keys to the global economy. The machine was the secret, and the secret was the machine. As the Han dynasty reached its zenith in the 2nd century BCE, the wealth thread faced a new and existential challenge. To the north, the fierce Xiongnu nomads, masters of horse-mounted warfare, posed a constant threat to the Chinese heartland. The Emperor Wudi, a ruler of immense ambition and cold calculation, realized that stone walls and foot soldiers were not enough to secure the empire. He needed a cavalry that could outrun and outfight the steppe warriors. He needed the legendary Fergana horses, known as the heavenly horses, which were said to sweat blood and possess supernatural endurance. However, these horses were located thousands of miles to the west, in the Fergana Valley of modern-day Uzbekistan. To get them, China had to do more than just fight, they had to buy. This was the moment silk was unleashed upon the world as a tool of high-stakes diplomacy. Emperor Wudi sent the explorer Zhong Qian on a series of perilous missions to the west, armed not with weapons of iron, but with wagons of silk. This was the true beginning of the Silk Road, a desperate search for military hardware funded by a luxury fabric. The logistics of these early missions were a nightmare of economic proportions. Zhong Qian was captured by the Xiongnu and held for over a decade before he could even reach his destination. When he finally returned, he brought news of a world that hungered for the wealth thread. He described kingdoms where the elite would trade their finest stallions for just a few bolts of patterned silk. This intel transformed the Han court into a massive trade engine. They weren't just producing fabric for beauty anymore, they were producing it to stay alive. The economics of this trade were staggering. The Fergana kings had never seen anything like Chinese silk. In their eyes, it was a supernatural material, perhaps woven from the air itself. One heavenly horse was worth approximately 40 bolts of high-grade silk. In the military ledger of the time, this meant a single elite stallion was valued at the equivalent of 40 years of a commoner's wages. To build a cavalry of 10,000 horses, the Han Emperor had to export 400,000 bolts of silk. In modern currency, we are talking about a military procurement project worth roughly $5.2 billion, paid for entirely in fabric. This exchange transformed the wealth thread into a geopolitical currency. Silk became the lubricant of empire. When the Han dynasty wanted to pacify a nomadic chieftain, they sent a gift of silk. When they wanted to secure a trade route, they paid the local tribes in silk. It was more effective than gold because it was lighter to transport across the shifting sands of the Taklamakan Desert and held a universal prestige that gold could not always match in the tribal lands. The very presence of silk in a remote desert outpost was a signal of the Han's limitless reach. It was the soft power that preceded the hard power of the cavalry. The expansion also birthed a new class of silk billionaires, the merchant caravans that dared to cross the Jade Gate into the unknown. These were not just traders, they were economic pioneers risking everything on a single shipment. A successful caravan, carrying perhaps 1,000 bolts of silk, was effectively a moving treasury. If it survived the bandits, the sandstorms, and the mountain passes, the profit margin was nearly 1,000%. A merchant could leave China a middle-class trader and return from the borderlands with enough wealth to buy an entire province. Consider the blood sweat of the horses. Legend says these horses bled as they ran. In reality, they were likely infected by skin parasites that caused small hemorrhages. Yet, to the Han, this was proof of their divine status. They were willing to bankrupt the imperial treasury, or rather, the imperial silk stores, to own them. This created a peculiar economic cycle. Peasants in the humid south of China worked day and night in the mulberry groves to produce the silk that would be sent thousands of miles away to buy the horses that protected the northern borders. It was a massive, countrywide redistribution of energy, all channeled through a single, shimmering thread. To manage this, the Han government established the first silk exchange. They regulated the quality of the military-grade silk to ensure the Fergana kings wouldn't feel cheated. A single thread out of place could result in the loss of a strategic alliance. The loom of heaven from the previous chapter was now working double shifts to meet the demands of the War Department. Silk was no longer just the fabric of the clouds, it was the armor of the state. But as the silk moved west in such massive quantities, the secret of its origin became even more strained. The more the world saw of the fabric, the more the West hungered for the source. The Han expansion had succeeded in securing the horses that China needed to survive, but in doing so, it had exposed the silk to a world of predators. The thread was now stretching toward the borders of India, Persia, and eventually, the hungry markets of Rome. China had bought its security, but it had started a global economic fire that it would eventually struggle to contain. The Emperor Wudi had his horses, and his borders were secure. But the wealth thread was no longer just a palace secret, it was now the nervous system of a growing global body. The price of peace was the exposure of the secret, and as the first bolts of silk reached the Mediterranean, the true war of the currents, the struggle for the control of the silk trade, was about to begin. To understand why a pound of silk eventually cost its weight in gold in the Roman markets, one must look at the map, not as a collection of lines, but as a series of death zones. The Silk Road was never a single, paved highway. It was a shifting, treacherous network of tracks that forced merchants to gamble with their lives every mile. The most feared segment of this journey was the Tarim Basin, home to the Taklamakan Desert. Its name, in local law, translates chillingly to, "You go in, but you do not come out." The Taklamakan is a furnace of shifting sands and singing dunes, that span over 130,000 square miles. For a caravan carrying the wealth thread, this was the ultimate test of capital. Water was more precious than the silk itself. Merchants had to time their crossings to the week, navigating between lethal sandstorms and temperatures that could swing from 50 degrees Celsius in the sun to below freezing at night. The cost of losing a single camel to thirst or a broken leg wasn't just a loss of life. It was the loss of $50,000 to $100,000 in modern cargo value. This geography of despair acted as a natural filter, ensuring that only the most desperate, or the most capitalized, could bring silk to the West. The psychological toll on the merchants added a hidden stress tax to the goods. Chroniclers of the era spoke of demons of the sands, auditory hallucinations caused by the extreme heat and the whistling of the wind through the dunes. These mirages often led caravans off the path and into the deep desert where they would vanish forever. To combat this, the leading merchants had to hire specialized desert guides whose fees were astronomical. A guide who could navigate by the stars and find the hidden underground springs could demand a percentage of the cargo's final value, sometimes as high as 5% of the entire shipment. Once past the desert, the terrain offered no relief, it only changed its method of execution. The caravans hit the roof of the world, the Pamir Mountains. Here, the wealth thread had to be hauled over passes exceeding 14,000 feet. At these altitudes, oxygen is thin, and the narrow ledge paths were often slick with ice. One misstep by a pack animal meant a bolt of imperial silk, representing a year of a weaver's life, would vanish into a 1,000-foot abyss. These mountain passes were the toll booths of nature, extracting a physical price that kept the supply of silk low and the prestige of the fabric high. The economic impact of this geography created a price ladder. For every week spent in the death zones, the value of the silk increased. A bolt of silk that cost 10 gold pieces at the Jade Gate in China would be worth 25 gold pieces by the time it reached the oasis of Samarkand, and 100 gold pieces by the time it reached the Mediterranean. The geography dictated a 900% markup driven entirely by risk. This wasn't just a profit margin, it was a hazard premium. Consider the insurance of the ancient world, there was none. A merchant was his own insurer. To mitigate risk, they traveled in massive caravanserais, fortified desert hotels spaced roughly 1 day's march apart, about 20 to 25 miles. The cost of staying in these forts, paying for protection from desert bandits, and bribing local warlords added another 15% to 20% to the final price of the thread. Furthermore, the forage for the camels, the fuel of the Silk Road, was priced at monopoly rates in these remote outposts. A merchant might spend the equivalent of $1,000 per night just to keep his animals fed and watered in the middle of the wasteland. This brutal geography served as the Middle Kingdom's best defense. Even if a Westerner knew that silk came from a moth, the physical barrier of the Taklamakan and the Pamirs made it nearly impossible to stage a raid or a biological theft. The geography of despair ensured that the secret remained locked in the east, and the wealth remained concentrated in the hands of those brave enough to navigate the graveyard. By the time a Roman senator felt the cool touch of silk against his skin, he was touching a fabric that had survived the most hostile environments on the planet. He wasn't just paying for thread, he was paying for the survival of the merchant who had cheated death to deliver it. While the Chinese produced the silk and the Romans hungered for it, neither side truly controlled the road. The space between empires, a vast, lawless stretch of desert and steppe, was the domain of the Sogdians. Originating from the city-states of Samarkand and Bukhara in modern-day Uzbekistan, these people were the ghost merchants of the Silk Road. They were a civilization built entirely on the movement of capital. They spoke every language, worshipped every god, and most importantly, they understood the fluctuating value of the wealth thread better than anyone on earth. To understand the Sogdian influence, one must view them as the world's first truly globalized venture capitalists. They did not just trade goods, they traded information. A Sogdian merchant living in a small outpost in western China would be in constant letter correspondence with a cousin in Byzantium and a business partner in the Indus Valley. These ancient emails, the famous Sogdian ancient letters, reveal a sophisticated world of credit, debt, and market speculation. They tracked the price of silk across 3 continents, knowing exactly where a bolt of silk could be sold for the highest margin. The economic infrastructure the Sogdians built was revolutionary. Because carrying massive amounts of gold or silver across the geography of despair was a magnet for bandits, the Sogdians refined the system of letters of credit. A merchant could deposit a certain amount of wealth in Samarkand and receive a parchment that would be honored by a Sogdian firm in Chang'an, thousands of miles away. This was the ancestor of the modern banking system, and it was fueled entirely by the need to move silk without moving heavy metal. By reducing the physical weight of money, they increased the velocity of the silk trade. The wealth of the Sogdians was visible in their cities. Samarkand became a metropolis of the thread, where the architecture itself was funded by the markups taken from the Silk Road. A Sogdian middleman didn't just take a flat fee, he operated on a system of value-added services. They were master translators, diplomats, and fixers. If a caravan was stuck at a border, the Sogdians knew which palm to grease. If a king needed a specific shade of imperial purple silk, the Sogdians knew which weaving house in China could produce it. For these services, they often took a cut of 10% to 15% of the total shipment value. Consider the scale of their operations. A typical Sogdian-led caravan could consist of 200 to 500 camels. If each camel carried roughly 300 pounds of silk, a single caravan was moving $20 million to $50 million in modern assets through some of the most dangerous territory on the planet. The Sogdians managed this risk through mercenary diplomacy. They paid massive protection fees to the nomadic Turkic khaganates of the north. In essence, the Sogdians were the tax collectors for the steppe lords, ensuring that as long as the silk flowed, the nomads wouldn't burn the trading posts. This was a fragile, expensive piece, but it was the only way the wealth thread could survive the journey. However, the Sogdians were more than just transporters, they were biological spies. Because they lived at the heart of the trade, they were the first to realize that the secret of silk was a vulnerable monopoly. Centuries before the secret officially leaked to the West, Sogdian colonies in Central Asia were already experimenting with wild silk and mulberry cultivation. They were the shadow manufacturers, creating high-quality Western silk that they would often mix with Chinese imports to maximize their profits. They were the masters of the counterfeit luxury market, knowing that a Roman aristocrat couldn't tell the difference between a bolt from the Yellow River and one from the Zarafshan Valley. The financial dominance of the Sogdians meant they were the ghost kings of the Silk Road. They owned the oases, they owned the water rights, and they owned the debt of the smaller merchants. Their language, Sogdian, became the lingua franca of trade, the English of the ancient world. If you wanted to get rich on the wealth thread, you had to speak the language of Samarkand. But their success was also their downfall. Their wealth made them targets for every rising empire, from the Arab caliphates to the Tang dynasty. Yet, even as their political power faded, their financial blueprint remained. They had taught the world that wealth isn't just about what you make, it's about how you move it. They proved that in the story of the wealth thread, the man who owns the road is often more powerful than the man who owns the loom. By the time the Sogdians faded into history, the Silk Road was no longer a path, it was a global financial system that had permanently connected the East and the West. By the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire was at the height of its power, yet it was being conquered from within, not by swords, but by a shimmering, translucent thread. To the Roman elite, silk was the ultimate expression of luxus. It was light, it took vibrant dyes better than wool or linen, and it had a sensuality that perfectly suited the opulent lifestyle of the imperial capital. But this obsession came with a staggering price tag. The Roman wealth thread was, in reality, a massive arterial bleed of the empire's gold and silver reserves heading straight into the pockets of Eastern middlemen and Chinese treasuries. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder was the most vocal critic of this economic hemorrhage. He famously lamented that by the lowest reckoning, India, China, and the Arabian Peninsula take from our empire 100 million sesterces every year, that is the sum our luxuries and our women cost us. To understand the scale of this Roman drain, we must look at the math. A single pound of high-quality silk in Rome often sold for its exact weight in gold. In modern terms, if an ounce of gold is worth $2,300, a standard silk robe weighing about 2 pounds would cost the equivalent of $73,600. This wasn't just a luxury purchase, it was a macroeconomic disaster. Because China had no use for Roman wool or wine, the trade was entirely asymmetrical. Rome had to pay in hard currency, gold and silver coins. This resulted in a massive specie outflow. As the gold left the empire to pay for the liquid gold of the East, the Roman government began to suffer from a liquidity crisis. To keep the economy moving and pay the legions, the emperors began to debase their currency. They reduced the silver content in the denarius, leading to rampant inflation. The wealth thread was literally thinning the value of Roman money. But the crisis was more than just financial, it was moral and political. The Roman Senate viewed silk as un-Roman. They argued that it was too transparent, that it made men effeminate, and that it stripped women of their modesty. In 16 CE, the Senate went so far as to pass a law forbidding men from wearing silk, declaring it a disgrace for a Roman citizen to be draped in a fabric so delicate. Yet, the law was largely ignored. The demand for silk was inelastic. No matter the cost, no matter the social stigma, the elite had to have it. This created a massive black market for silk, further enriching the Sogdian ghost merchants who operated outside Roman law. The trade also created a logistical dependency that weakened Roman sovereignty. Because Rome did not control the Silk Road, they were at the mercy of the Parthian Empire, modern-day Iran. The Parthians acted as the ultimate gateman, taking a massive cut of every shipment. Whenever Rome and Parthia went to war, the supply of silk vanished, and the price skyrocketed. This gave the Parthians immense economic leverage over Rome. The wealth thread was being used as a tether, pulling Roman foreign policy toward the east and forcing the Caesars to engage in costly wars just to secure their supply of luxury fabric. Consider the wealth leak from a systemic perspective. At its peak, the silk trade accounted for nearly 10% of the entire Roman imperial budget. Imagine a modern nation spending 10% of its GDP on a single imported luxury item that provides no military or industrial utility. It was a consumption trap. The gold that could have been used to repair the Appian Way or strengthen the Danubian frontier was instead being sent across the desert to buy the secretions of a moth. The irony of the Roman drain was that the Romans had no idea where the silk actually came from. They called the Chinese the Cis, or the silk people, but they believed the fabric grew on trees or was harvested from the hair of sea creatures. This ignorance prevented them from attempting their own production for centuries. They were trapped in a sunk cost fallacy, believing that the only way to maintain their status was to keep paying the gold price for the Eastern thread. By the time of the late Empire, the drain had taken its toll. The gold reserves were depleted, the currency was a shadow of its former self, and the social fabric of Rome was as thin as the silk they prized. The wealth thread had connected the world, but it had also acted as a siphon, drawing the lifeblood out of the West and concentrating it in the East. It was the first trade war in history, and Rome was losing, not on the battlefield, but at the tailor's shop. The Silk Road is often depicted as a masculine epic, a saga of rugged merchants, camel drivers, and armored conquerors. But if you were to strip away the dust and the drama, you would find that the entire multi-billion-dollar structure rested on the shoulders of the women of rural China. In the Chinese social order, there was a foundational proverb: men plow, women weave. This wasn't just a cultural tradition, it was a rigorous economic mandate. Silk was a domestic industry, meaning the factory floor was the family home, and the CEO of production was almost always a woman. To hit the staggering production quotas demanded by the Imperial Silk Bureau, a peasant woman's life was governed by the biological clock of the silkworm. During the silk moon, the peak month of larvae growth, sleep became a luxury more expensive than the fabric itself. Because the Bombyx mori required feeding every few hours, day and night, women lived in a state of permanent exhaustion. They were the ones who climbed the mulberry trees to harvest the leaves, the ones who finely chopped them to ensure the youngest worms could eat, and the ones who monitored the charcoal fires to ensure the room stayed at an exact, humid temperature. The economic pressure was immense. In many dynasties, taxes were not paid in grain or coin, but in labor and finished silk. A typical household was required to deliver a specific quota of silk bolts to the government every year. If the silkworms died due to a sudden cold snap or a loud noise, the family didn't just lose their income, they became debtors to the state. This made the domestic sphere a high-stakes production environment. A woman's skill at the loom or her intuition for the health of the worms determined the survival of her entire family. But this hidden labor was also a source of secret power. Because women controlled the production of the most valuable commodity on earth, they occupied a unique space in the Chinese economy. In many villages, women managed their own silk circles, sharing techniques and labor. While they were often excluded from the formal political world, they were the masters of the liquid gold that funded that world. When we talk about the $2 billion Roman trade deficit, we are talking about the collective output of millions of women working by lamplight in remote river valleys. The physical toll of this labor was written on their bodies. Reeling silk required dipping hands into near-boiling water for hours at a time to find the ends of the cocoons. The steam would often cause chronic respiratory issues, and the repetitive motion of the loom led to early-onset joint damage. Yet, the precision required was surgical. A master reeler could pull a thread so consistent that even when magnified, the thickness remained uniform across a mile of length. This level of quality control, achieved without modern sensors or machines, is one of the greatest technical feats of the ancient world. From a monetary perspective, the value added by this domestic labor was the true profit of the Silk Road. Raw silk was valuable, but finished silk, dyed, patterned, and embroidered, was where the real wealth resided. A woman might spend 600 hours embroidering a single imperial robe. If we calculate the opportunity cost of that time, she was effectively creating an asset that would sell in the West for the equivalent of 5 to 10 years of her family's total consumption. However, the wealth thread was a cruel master. The vast majority of that profit was siphoned off by state taxes and Sogdian middlemen, leaving the producer with just enough to start the cycle again the following year. The hidden labor also served a strategic purpose for the state. By keeping production decentralized in millions of homes, the Chinese government ensured that the secret was distributed. There was no single factory for a spy to burn down, no central laboratory to infiltrate. The secret lived in the collective muscle memory of the female population. It was a biological and technical heritage passed from mother to daughter for 100 generations. As the thread moved from the cottage to the caravan, the woman who made it vanished from the narrative. Her name was never recorded in the ledgers of the Silk Road, but her fingerprints were on every inch of the fabric that draped the Caesars. She was the silent engine of the global economy, the one who turned mulberry leaves into the most coveted currency in history. For nearly 3,000 years, the secret of silk was the most guarded intellectual property in human history. It was a biological fortress that no empire could breach, until the year 552 CE. This chapter tells the story of the Byzantine heist, the world's most audacious and consequential act of industrial espionage. It is the moment the wealth thread was finally severed from its Chinese roots, forever altering the economic map of the world. The protagonist of this heist was the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I. His empire, centered in Constantinople, was the western terminus of the Silk Road. Justinian was a man of immense ambition, but his treasury was being bled dry by the Roman drain we discussed earlier. He was tired of paying the Persians, the Sassanid middlemen, extortionate markups, and he was tired of his gold flowing into a Chinese black hole. He didn't just want to buy silk, he wanted to own the means of production. The opportunity came in the form of two Nestorian monks who had lived in the East, likely in Central Asia or China. They approached the emperor with a proposition that sounded like alchemy. They claimed they could bring the liquid gold to Constantinople. They didn't mean the fabric, they meant the life cycle. Justinian, realizing that this was a chance to break a 3-millennium monopoly, funded their mission. The stakes were absolute. If caught, the monks faced the death of 1,000 cuts. There would be no diplomatic immunity for holy men stealing the emperor of China's most private treasure. The monks understood that you could not smuggle a live silkworm. The Bombyx mori was too fragile, too noisy, and required a constant supply of fresh mulberry leaves. Instead, they had to steal the eggs. But eggs are sensitive to temperature and light. The solution was a stroke of low-tech genius. The monks hollowed out their heavy bamboo walking staves. In the dark, insulated interior of these canes, they hid thousands of tiny, pepper-like silkworm eggs. To the border guards and silk bureau inspectors, they were just two weary pilgrims with nothing but their faith and their walking sticks. The journey back was a race against biology. If the eggs hatched inside the canes before they reached Constantinople, the mission was a failure. The monks had to navigate the geography of despair, the mountains and deserts we've walked through, while keeping their staves at a stable temperature. When they finally arrived at the imperial palace in 552 CE, they didn't just bring eggs, they brought the seeds of the white mulberry tree. Justinian was ready. He had already cleared land for imperial mulberry groves. When the eggs hatched, the Byzantine Empire became the first Western power to possess a self-sustaining silk industry. The economic impact was immediate and seismic. The value of this heist is almost impossible to calculate in modern terms, but we can look at the monopoly rent that Justinian effectively stole. Before the heist, the Byzantine Empire was spending an estimated 5 to 8 million gold solidi annually on imported silk. By producing it domestically, Justinian wasn't just saving that gold, he was creating a new revenue stream. He established an imperial silk monopoly, where the state controlled every loom. The Byzantine wealth thread became the engine of the medieval European economy. For the next several centuries, Byzantine silk was the gold standard. A single ceremonial robe produced in the imperial workshops of Constantinople could be valued at 100 gold solidi, roughly the equivalent of $25,000 to $30,000 in modern purchasing power. Justinian had successfully turned a pair of hollow sticks into a multi-billion-dollar state enterprise. But the heist did more than just fill the Byzantine coffers, it broke the global price floor. For 3,000 years, China had dictated the price of silk because they were the only ones who knew how to make it. Now, there was competition. The blood price of the secret had been paid, and the thread was starting to unravel. This led to a price correction across the Silk Road. Within a century of the heist, the price of raw silk in the Mediterranean dropped by nearly 30%, as the Byzantine supply began to saturate the European market. The Byzantine heist is the ultimate example of how a single piece of biological data, the eggs of a moth, can shift the balance of power between continents. It proved that in the world of the wealth thread, information was more valuable than gold. Justinian's monks had committed the ultimate intellectual property theft, and in doing so, they ensured that the shimmer of silk would eventually be seen in every corner of the globe. By the 8th and 9th centuries, the Islamic caliphates had achieved something the Romans never could. They controlled both the production centers of the East and the consumer markets of the West. Under the Umayyads and the Abbasids, silk production became a decentralized but highly regulated global industry. They introduced the white mulberry and the bombyx mori to new climates, Persia, Syria, North Africa, and eventually, the fertile plains of Andalusia in Spain. This was the first time in history that silk was being produced on 3 different continents under a single economic and legal system. The Islamic world's greatest contribution to the wealth thread was the tiraz system. The tiraz were state-run or state-licensed factories that produced high-end textiles, often inscribed with the name of the caliph or religious blessings. This was branded luxury on a majestic scale. These factories functioned like a medieval version of a central bank. Because silk was so stable in value, the caliphs used it as a form of political currency. They didn't just pay their generals in gold, they paid them in khalat, robes of honor made of the finest tiraz silk. To receive a robe from the caliphs was to receive a liquid asset that could be sold in any market from Cordoba to Baghdad for a predictable, high price. This expansion was fueled by a sophisticated agricultural revolution. The caliphates invested heavily in qanats, underground irrigation tunnels, to bring water to arid regions, specifically to support the thirsty mulberry trees. This infrastructure was a massive capital expenditure. In Persia, a single irrigation project could cost the equivalent of $10 million modern USD, but it was seen as a necessary investment to capture the wealth thread. This vertical integration meant that the state didn't just tax the finished fabric, they owned the water that fed the trees that fed the worms. The taxation of this industry was equally advanced. The kharaj, or land tax, was often levied based on the number of mulberry trees a farmer owned. In the province of Khuzestan, the silk tax alone provided nearly 25% of the regional revenue. This created a tax-driven production model, where farmers were incentivized to maximize their silk output to cover their state obligations. By the 10th century, the city of Merv was so productive it was known as the Mother of the World, housing over 10,000 professional weavers whose collective output was valued at millions of gold dinars. The economics of the Islamic silk web were further stabilized by Sharia-compliant financial instruments. Because the Silk Road was long and dangerous, Muslim merchants refined the suftaja, an early form of a bill of exchange, and the mudaraba, a profit-sharing investment partnership. A wealthy investor in Baghdad could fund a silk caravan heading to Morocco without ever leaving his home. This capital sourcing allowed for a massive scale-up in production. The wealth thread was no longer just about the moth, it was about the contract. Consider the market value in the 10th century Abbasid Caliphate. A single high-quality silk turban could cost 20 to 30 gold dinars. Given that a comfortable middle-class family could live on roughly 2 dinars a month, a single silk accessory represented over a year's worth of living expenses. In modern terms, imagine walking around with a $60,000 to $80,000 asset wrapped around your head. The Islamic world had turned silk into the ultimate portable wealth, a currency that was accepted in every mosque, marketplace, and palace from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. The caliphates also revolutionized the chemistry of color. They utilized their advanced knowledge of alchemy to create standardized dyes, deep indigos, vibrant madder reds, and the legendary Kermes crimson derived from crushed insects. These dyes were expensive. A pound of high-quality indigo could cost as much as 10 bolts of plain silk. By combining the Byzantine weaving techniques with Persian aesthetics and Arab chemistry, they created a product that was superior to anything previously seen. The most profound impact, however, was the standardization of quality. The caliphate's inspectors, or mutasib, patrolled the markets to ensure that the thread count and the purity of the dyes met strict legal standards. This gave international buyers the confidence to trade sight unseen. You could buy a bale of Baghdad silk in a market in Sicily and know exactly what you were getting. The wealth thread had become a bridge between civilizations, a common language of value that transcended religion and war. As the Crusades ignited in the 11th century, a strange phenomenon occurred. European knights, returning from the Levant, brought back more than just stories of holy war. They brought back a sensory addiction to the liquid gold of the East. To the rough-hewn nobility of Western Europe, who were accustomed to the scratch of coarse wool and the stiff weight of heavy linens, the silks of the Islamic world, known as damask, felt like a divine revelation. In a world where power was signaled through visible splendor, silk became the ultimate texture of power. The economic irony was profound and reached the highest levels of the medieval deep state. Christian kings, while taxing their subjects to fund bloody wars against the caliphates, were simultaneously draining their treasuries to enrich the Islamic economy for the sake of their own wardrobes. In the courts of Norman Sicily and the Holy Roman Empire, the most coveted robes were those produced in the Tiraz workshops of Egypt and Syria. These fabrics were so technically superior that European monarchs began to view them as the only material worthy of divine right. They weren't just buying clothes, they were buying the sovereignty of the thread. To understand the monetary weight of this obsession, consider the coronation mantle of Roger II of Sicily, created in 1133. This single garment, fashioned from red silk dyed with kermes and embroidered with gold thread and over 100,000 pearls, was valued at a sum that could have funded an entire military campaign. In modern purchasing power, a robe of this caliber represented an investment of roughly $1.5 million. For a medieval king, wearing such a mantle was a strategic financial move. It was a portable display of the state's total creditworthiness. If a king could afford the wealth thread, he could afford an army. The church, too, became a primary engine of consumption for this infidel silk. In a bizarre twist of fate, many of the most sacred Christian relics and the bodies of canonized saints were wrapped in Islamic silks inscribed with Arabic calligraphy praising Allah. To the medieval European mind, the beauty of the silk was so absolute that its religious origin was secondary to its heavenly quality. The demand for these burial shrouds created a massive grave wealth economy. Thousands of bolts of high-grade silk were literally buried in cathedrals across Europe, representing an intentional destruction of supply that kept the global price of the thread perpetually high. The markup for these imports was astronomical. By the time a bolt of Syrian silk reached the fairs of Champagne in France, it had passed through dozens of hands, from Venetian sea captains to Jewish financiers and Genoese brokers. The transaction tax and the risk premium meant that silk in Europe cost 600% to 800% more than it did in the markets of Baghdad. A single yard of patterned brocade could cost 15 silver marks, roughly the price of a high-grade warhorse or 2 years' rent for a merchant's house in London. This texture of power also dictated the internal hierarchies of Europe. Sumptuary laws began to appear, forbidding anyone below the rank of a count or a bishop from wearing the wealth thread. These weren't just about vanity, they were about protecting the currency of prestige. If a merchant could wear the same silk as a king, the king's brand value collapsed. Consequently, the state enforced the value of silk with the same vigor it used to protect the minting of coins. This era also saw the birth of heraldry as we know it. The complex patterns woven into Islamic silk provided the aesthetic blueprint for European coats of arms. The wealth thread was literally weaving the visual identity of the Western aristocracy. But as the gold flowed east to pay for these status symbols, European leaders began to experience the same specie drain that had crippled Rome. The trade balance was a disaster. Europe had plenty of timber and wool, but the East wanted gold, and the East had a monopoly on the thread that made a man a king. They realized that to be a true power, they couldn't just consume the thread, they had to seize the machine. This desperation led to the rise of silk mercenaries. During the Second Crusade, the Norman king Roger II launched a raid specifically targeting the Byzantine silk centers of Thebes and Corinth. He didn't want their gold, he wanted their workers. He forcibly relocated thousands of Jewish and Greek silk craftsmen to Palermo, Sicily. This was industrial kidnapping on a grand scale. By stealing the humans who held the code of the thread, he bypassed 3,000 years of Chinese and Persian secrets. This theft in Sicily was the spark for the European silk industry. It turned Italy from a customer into a competitor. The wealth thread was no longer just an import, it was becoming a domestic financial asset. As the looms of Palermo and Lucca began to hum, the economic center of gravity started to pull away from the Silk Road and toward the Mediterranean. The texture of power was shifting, and the liquid gold was about to build the foundations of the Italian Renaissance. By the 14th century, the city-state of Lucca had become the Silicon Valley of the Middle Ages. Having inherited the stolen secrets of the Byzantine and Sicilian weavers, Lucca's engineers perfected the circular silk mill, a massive, water-powered machine that could throw silk thread with a precision and speed that manual labor could never match. This was the first true industrialization of the wealth thread. To the Italian merchant bankers, silk was no longer just a fabric, it was a high-yield asset class. The economic dominance of Italy during the Renaissance was built on a foundation of silk. In Florence, the Arte della Seta, the Silk Guild, became one of the most powerful political entities in the city. They didn't just regulate quality, they regulated capital flow. To understand the scale, consider that at its peak, the Florentine silk industry employed nearly 15,000 people, roughly 15% to 20% of the city's entire population. The wealth thread was the General Motors of the Renaissance. If the looms stopped, the city's economy collapsed. This is where the Medici Bank enters the narrative. The Medici realized that the silk trade offered a unique opportunity for arbitrage. Because silk was light and immensely valuable, it could be used to move wealth across borders more safely than gold bullion. A merchant could buy a bale of Florentine velvet for 500 gold florins, ship it to London, and sell it for 800 florins. The profit wasn't just in the fabric, it was in the currency exchange. By controlling the production of the silk and the banks that financed the trade, the Medici created a closed-loop system of wealth accumulation. The velvets of the Medici were the ultimate high-margin product. A single yard of Florentine 7-pile velvet, so thick it could practically stand on its own, required the silk of over 3,000 cocoons and hundreds of hours of labor. These fabrics were often woven with looped gold and silver threads, creating a three-dimensional texture that shimmered in the candlelight of the great cathedrals. The price for such a material was astronomical. A single bolt could cost 300 to 500 gold florins. To put that in perspective, the annual salary of a skilled master mason was about 50 florins. A single piece of fabric was worth 10 years of professional human labor. This concentration of wealth directly funded the Renaissance. When we look at the masterpieces of Botticelli, Titian, or Bronzino, we aren't just looking at paint, we are looking at silk advertisements. The subjects of these portraits, the dukes, the popes, and the merchant princes, are almost always draped in the most expensive silks imaginable. The painters were hired not just to capture a likeness, but to meticulously render the specific sheen and drape of the family's silk holdings. In a very real sense, the Renaissance was a visual celebration of the wealth thread's triumph. The Italian monopoly on European silk was protected with a brutality reminiscent of the ancient Chinese emperors. In Lucca, any weaver who attempted to take the secrets of the circular silk mill outside the city walls faced the death penalty. If a master weaver fled to a rival city like Venice or Lyon, the Lucchese government would hire assassins to track them down. This was industrial protectionism at its most extreme. The Italians knew that their liquid gold depended on a technological moat that kept the rest of Europe as customers rather than competitors. Furthermore, the silk industry gave birth to modern double-entry bookkeeping. The sheer complexity of managing the loom of heaven, from the purchase of raw silk in the Levant to the dyeing in Florence and the final sale in Bruges, required a level of accounting that didn't exist before. The wealth thread forced the human mind to become more organized, more mathematical, and more global. It wasn't just the fabric that was being refined, it was the very structure of Western capitalism. By the time the Renaissance reached its height, Italy had successfully replaced the Silk Road as the primary source of luxury for the West. The ghost merchants of the desert had been replaced by the merchant princes of the Mediterranean. The wealth thread had finally completed its journey from a Chinese peasant cottage to a Florentine counting house, and in the process, it had woven the financial architecture that would eventually give rise to the modern world. By the late 15th century, the European mind was becoming obsessed with the pattern. Whether it was the rhythmic layout of a sonnet, the geometric perspective of a painting, or the intricate repeat of a silk damask, the West was learning to think in grids. The wealth thread was at the center of this cognitive revolution. The weavers of Italy and France had reached a level of complexity where a single bolt of silk could contain thousands of distinct points of intersection. To manage this, they developed the point paper, the first true grid-based design system. Before a weaver ever touched a loom, the pattern had to be mapped out on a grid, where each square represented a single thread crossing. This was the birth of pixelation. A silk designer was essentially coding an image into a coordinate system. This grid-based thinking began to leak out of the weaving workshops and into the workshops of the early printers. In fact, many of the earliest decorative borders and fleuron ornaments found in Gutenberg-era books were direct copies of silk patterns. The wealth thread provided the visual language for the knowledge thread. This mental shift was not merely aesthetic, it was structural. The silk designer had to visualize a finished, three-dimensional product through a two-dimensional, binary set of instructions. This required a level of abstract reasoning that was rare in the medieval world. It taught the European artisan to see the ghost in the machine, the idea that a complex, beautiful output was simply the result of a perfectly executed, invisible logic. As silk patterns became more floral and lifelike, the data points required to render them grew smaller and more numerous. This was the earliest form of high-definition rendering, pushing the limits of what human eyes and hands could coordinate before the invention of the microscope. As the 16th century progressed, this connection between silk and information deepened. The complexity of the patterns forced weavers to develop more advanced draw looms, which utilized a system of cords and pulleys that functioned remarkably like a mechanical memory bank. The loom remembered the pattern through the arrangement of these cords. If you look at the internal workings of a high-end Renaissance loom, you aren't looking at a simple tool, you are looking at an analog computer. The software was the pattern, and the hardware was the loom. The financial value of this patterned intelligence was immense. A plain silk remained a luxury, but a figured or brocaded silk, one that utilized these complex mechanical programs, could command a 400% markup. This surplus wealth funded the intellectual infrastructure of Europe. The very people who were buying these programmed silks, the scholars, the scientists, and the bankers, were the ones whose thought processes were being shaped by the logic of the grid. The wealth thread was training the Western eye to see the world as a series of interlocking, reproducible data points. Consider the role of paper in this exchange. Originally, the West imported paper from the East along the same routes as silk. In many ways, paper was seen as silk for the mind, a smooth, white surface for the storage of value. The two industries grew in tandem. The same hydraulic technology used to power silk mills in Lucca was adapted to power paper mills. The wealth thread and the information thread were literally being manufactured using the same mechanical principles. This era also saw the rise of the designer as a distinct professional class. Previously, the weaver was the creator. Now, a designer would create the code on point paper, and a technician would execute it on the loom. This separation of design from execution is one of the hallmarks of modern industrial capitalism. It turned the human labor of the loom into a secondary function of the pattern of thought. The value had shifted from the physical act of weaving to the mental act of programming. By treating the image as a set of instructions rather than a unique brushstroke, the silk industry prepared the world for the age of mass production. By the time the printing press had fully matured, it had adopted the silk industry's obsession with standardization, grids, and mass reproducibility. The wealth thread had provided the cognitive scaffolding for the information age. Every time we look at a digital screen today, composed of a grid of pixels, we are looking at the direct descendant of a Renaissance silk designer's point paper. We are still living inside the pattern that the silkworm and the loom started weaving 500 years ago. When Louis XIV took the throne, France was a nation in the midst of a cultural and financial identity crisis. The kingdom was suffering from a massive, systemic trade deficit. Every year, millions of gold livres flowed out of the country, crossing the Alps to buy Italian velvets and crossing the Pyrenees for Spanish laces. To Louis and his brilliant, cold-blooded finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, this was more than a financial leak, it was a surrender of sovereignty. Colbert famously remarked that fashion is to France what the gold mines of Peru are to Spain. He realized that if France could control the aesthetic of power, the rest of the world would be forced to pay France for the privilege of looking important. The strategy they unleashed was one of aggressive, state-sponsored industrial mercantilism. Colbert established the city of Lyon as the mandatory epicenter of French silk production, granting it an absolute monopoly that was enforced by royal decree. He didn't just incentivize the industry, he codified it. He loaded Italian master weavers with the promise of immense wealth and tax exemptions, while simultaneously issuing a terrifying warning: any French weaver caught taking their secrets abroad would face the death penalty. But the true genius of the French system lay in the invention of the seasonality of the thread. To ensure the looms of Lyon never stopped turning, Colbert and Louis invented the concept of fashion seasons. They decreed that certain patterns, weights, and colors of silk were only legal to wear during specific months of the year. If an aristocrat wore a spring silk in the autumn, they were not just a social pariah, they were practically a dissident. This forced the global aristocracy to replace their entire wardrobes every 6 months. It was the birth of planned obsolescence in the luxury market, creating a permanent, artificial hunger for the wealth thread. The cost of this vanity was staggering. The palace was not merely a residence, it was a 2,000-acre showroom for French silk. Every wall was draped in Lyon damask, every gilded chair was upholstered in silk. Louis XIV's personal wardrobe was a major line item in the national budget. A single formal jacket made of gold-brocaded silk could cost over 12,000 livres. To put that in perspective, a French foot soldier earned about 100 livres a year. A single outfit for the king represented 120 years of military service. This was shock and awe through textiles. When foreign ambassadors visited Versailles, they were overwhelmed by a sensory barrage of silk. They saw a king who appeared to be woven from light itself, standing in a room where every surface shimmered with the labor of thousands of weavers. They returned to their own countries convinced that France was the wealthiest nation on earth, even when the French treasury was actually struggling. The wealth thread was a tool of geopolitical gaslighting, projecting an image of infinite resources. The financial impact was transformative. By 1683, the silk industry was the single largest sector of the French economy, employing nearly 1 million people across the entire supply chain, from the mulberry peasants in the sun-drenched south to the master embroiderers in the dim lofts of Paris. France had successfully flipped the trade deficit. Now, the gold of Europe was flowing into Paris to pay for the newest Lyon pattern. The wealth thread had built the navy that patrolled the Atlantic and funded the armies that dominated the continent. Colbert also established the Garde Mobile de la Couronne, a department dedicated entirely to the inventory, design, and preservation of royal textiles. They developed the Grand Teint, Great Dye, regulations, a set of 317 strict rules that governed exactly how silk could be colored. If a dyer was caught using a petit tan, cheap, fading dye, to cut costs, they were fined thousands of livres or sent to the galleys. This obsession with quality created a brand premium for French silk that has lasted for over 3 centuries. By the late 1600s, Lyon was housing over 18,000 looms, and French silk had surpassed Italian silk in both volume and prestige. Furthermore, Louis XIV used silk as a form of domestic containment. By establishing a strict court etiquette that required increasingly complex and expensive silk costumes to stay in his favor, he effectively bankrupted the feudal lords who might have rebelled against his central authority. A duke who spent his entire fortune on gold-embroidered waistcoats had no money left to fund a private army or a provincial revolt. Silk had become the velvet cage of the French aristocracy. By the end of the Sun King's reign, the wealth thread had moved from the counting house to the heart of the state. It was no longer just about money, it was about the French brand. Louis XIV had ensured that the language of luxury would be French, and that the world would look to Lyon for the definition of beauty. The loom had become a pillar of the throne, and the silkworm had become the silent architect of the French Empire. By the year 1800, the silk industry in Lyon was at a breaking point. The world's hunger for increasingly complex brocades and damasks had outpaced the capacity of human fingers. To weave the intricate floral patterns demanded by the post-revolutionary elite, a weaver needed a drawboy, a child who sat atop the loom and manually pulled hundreds of individual cords in a precise sequence for every single pass of the shuttle. It was slow, prone to error, and humanly exhausting. The wealth thread was trapped in a mechanical bottleneck. The price of error was high. One wrong cord pulled meant a ruined bolt of fabric and a week of lost wages. Enter Joseph Marie Jacquard. A weaver by trade, Jacquard was also an intuitive engineer who realized that the pattern of thought didn't need a human to remember it, it just needed a code. In 1804, he perfected the Jacquard loom, a machine that would change the trajectory of human history. The genius of Jacquard's invention was the punched card. He translated the grid-based point paper designs into a series of stiff cardboard cards with holes punched in them. As the cards passed through the loom, a series of needles would attempt to pass through the holes. If there was a hole, the needle passed through and lifted a specific thread. If there was no hole, the needle was blocked, and the thread stayed down. This was a binary system, 0 or 1, yes or no, hole or no hole. This was the first time in history that a complex, creative task, the weaving of a beautiful image, had been fully digitized. The wealth thread was now being controlled by software. Jacquard had successfully separated the information of the pattern from the physicality of the machine. To appreciate the scale of this leap, we must look at the data density. A complex silk portrait of Jacquard himself, commissioned to prove the machine's capability, required 24,000 punched cards. Each card represented a single line of the weave, a single instruction for the loom to execute. This was a massive program executed by a mechanical processor. For the first time, the wealth in the thread wasn't just the silk itself, but the information stored in the cards. Once a pattern was punched, it could be replicated perfectly, infinitely, and without the need for a highly skilled master weaver to supervise the cords. The economic disruption was seismic. In Lyon, the master weavers, the canoe, realized that Jacquard had effectively de-skilled their profession. If a machine could remember the pattern, the weaver was no longer an artist-mathematician, they were a mere machine operator. This led to the famous canoe revolts of the 1830s, some of the first industrial uprisings in history. The weavers took to the streets with the slogan, "Live working, or die fighting." The state's reaction was brutal. King Louis-Philippe sent 20,000 troops to crush the silk workers. This wasn't just a labor dispute, it was a war over the future of human labor versus machine logic. The wealth thread was at the heart of the first great existential crisis of the Industrial Revolution. But capital favored the machine. The Jacquard loom increased production speed by 2,000%, and the cost of patterned silk plummeted, making silk accessible to the rising global middle class for the first time in history. But the story of the wealth thread doesn't stop at the textile factory. In the 1830s, an English mathematician named Charles Babbage saw the Jacquard loom in action. He was mesmerized by how a machine could weave algebraic patterns. Babbage realized that if you could use punched cards to tell a loom which threads to lift, you could use them to tell a calculator which mathematical operations to perform. Babbage's collaborator, Ada Lovelace, the world's first computer programmer, made the connection explicit. She famously wrote, "The analytical engine weaves algebraic patterns just as the Jacquard loom weaves flowers and leaves." The binary logic that we use today to send emails, stream videos, and power artificial intelligence was born directly from the need to automate the production of silk. The wealth thread provided the mechanical grammar for the entire computer age. The financial legacy of the Jacquard loom was the birth of scalable intellectual property. For 3,000 years, the value of silk was in the physical labor and the biological secret. Now, the value was in the code. A successful silk pattern could be sold as a deck of cards to mills across Europe and America. This was the ancestor of the software industry. The liquid gold had become liquid data. As the 19th century progressed, the punched card moved from the loom to the tabulating machines of the U.S. Census, and eventually into the early mainframe computers of IBM. The holes that once told a needle how to weave a rose eventually told a computer how to land a man on the moon. Every bit of data we consume today, every pixel on your screen, is a distant, digital echo of a silk thread being lifted in a Lyon workshop. The wealth thread didn't just clothe the world, it taught the world how to calculate. By 1865, the silk capital of Lyon was a city in mourning. A mysterious disease known as pebrine, named for the peppery black spots that appeared on the silkworms, was sweeping through the nurseries of France and Italy. It was a biological wildfire. Within a decade, French silk production plummeted from 26,000 tons to a mere 4,000 tons. The liquid gold was drying up, and with it, the livelihoods of millions. The French government, desperate to save its most valuable export, turned to the man who would become the father of microbiology, Louis Pasteur. To understand the magnitude of this crisis, one must realize that at the time, germ theory was still a radical, unproven hypothesis. Most farmers believed the blight was caused by bad air, atmospheric electricity, or divine punishment. The industry was in a state of primitive superstition. Desperate breeders were trying to cure the worms by sprinkling them with vinegar, wine, or even sulfur, which only served to accelerate their deaths. Pasteur, who had never even seen a silkworm before this commission, spent 5 grueling years in the small town of Ailes, living among the dying larvae. His investigation into the wealth thread became one of the most significant scientific case studies in history, marking the moment that wealth production moved from the hands of the farmer to the lens of the scientist. Pasteur discovered that pebrine wasn't just a disease, it was a parasitic invasion passed from the mother moth to her eggs. This was a revolutionary realization in hereditary transmission. He observed that even a seemingly healthy worm could be a silent carrier, harboring the parasite that would inevitably kill the next generation. But the crisis was doubled by a second disease, flatchery, which was caused by bacteria in the worm's digestive tracts, often triggered by poor ventilation or fermented mulberry leaves. The wealth thread was being attacked by 2 invisible fronts simultaneously, one hereditary and one environmental. Pasteur's solution was as elegant as it was rigorous, the Pasteur method. He instructed farmers to use a microscope to examine every single female moth after she had finished laying her eggs. The process was cold and clinical. The moth was crushed in a mortar, and her remains were examined. If the moth showed even a trace of the pepper black spots under the lens, her eggs were immediately burned. This was the first large-scale application of biological screening in history. It turned every silk nursery into a high-stakes laboratory where the microscope was the only thing standing between a family's fortune and their total ruin. The economic stakes were astronomical. During the peak of the plague, the price of raw silk in Europe spiked by 300%, causing a ripple effect that nearly bankrupted the great banks of Lyon and Turin. The specie drain we saw in Rome returned, as European merchants were forced to ship massive amounts of gold back to the East to buy healthy eggs. This sparked an emergency trade bridge with Japan, which had remained relatively isolated. The Pasteur cure didn't just save the French worm, it reintegrated the global silk market, connecting the high-tech laboratories of the West with the ancient traditions of the East in a new, scientific partnership that laid the groundwork for modern globalism. The financial legacy of this cure was the birth of agricultural science. Pasteur proved that wealth wasn't just about owning the land or the loom, it was about controlling the microbiome. The French state realized that the wealth thread was a fragile biological asset that required constant scientific oversight. This led to the creation of the first state-funded sericulture research stations, ensuring that the moth's health was monitored as closely as the nation's gold reserves. The laboratory had become the new Jade Gate. Furthermore, the work Pasteur did on silkworms provided the foundational data he needed to develop vaccines for anthrax and rabies. The wealth thread literally funded the birth of modern medicine. The techniques we use today to screen for genetic diseases or manage livestock epidemics are the direct descendants of a man in a dusty French village trying to save a tiny green caterpillar. Pasteur's war against the pepper spots was the opening salvo in humanity's war against infectious disease. By the time the plague was finally contained, the industry had changed. The Pasteur method required capital, microscopes, trained technicians, and sterile environments. This accelerated the shift from the small peasant cottage to the industrial silkworm factory. The wealth thread was now a product of the laboratory as much as the mulberry grove. Pasteur had saved the secret of silk, but in doing so, he had transformed it into a modern, standardized, and scientifically managed commodity. He had proven that in the industrial age, the most valuable tool for creating wealth was no longer the plow or the sword, but the microscope. By 1939, the global economy was inextricably tangled in silk, but the nature of the demand had shifted. While the 1920s had been defined by the stocking boom, where millions of women in the West fueled a massive resurgence in Japanese exports, the looming shadow of war transformed the fabric into a matter of national security. The reason was simple: the parachute. Before the invention of reliable synthetics, silk was the only material on Earth with the specific physical properties required for vertical warfare. It was incredibly light, allowing a 28-foot canopy to be folded into a compact backpack, yet it was immensely strong, able to withstand the violent opening shock of a human body falling at terminal velocity. Perhaps most importantly, it was elastic. It could stretch without snapping under the weight of a fully equipped paratrooper. In the cold logic of 1940s logistics, a nation without silk was a nation without an airborne division. The financial and industrial implications of this strategic pivot were immediate and violent. On August 2, 1941, the United States government issued a total silk freeze. The Office of Production Management ordered the seizure of all raw silk stocks in the country. The wealth thread was no longer a commodity to be traded for profit. It was a confiscated war material. Overnight, the multi-million-dollar hosiery industry was decapitated. Department stores across America saw silk riots, as women scrambled to buy the last remaining pairs of stockings before they vanished for a decade. This was a massive supply shock. Within 24 hours of the freeze, the retail price of silk stockings on the black market rose by 500%. The war economy of the thread was defined by staggering numbers. A single standard parachute required approximately 65 to 70 yards of high-grade silk, and outfitting a single airborne division like the 101st Screaming Eagles required over 1 million yards of fabric. During the course of the war, the U.S. military would consume over 5 million pounds of raw silk, an astronomical amount for a material produced by tiny larvae. Since 90% of the world's raw silk came from Japan, now the enemy, the Allies were essentially cut off from their primary source of a critical weapon. This scarcity turned silk into a shadow currency with a value that far outstripped its weight in gold. In occupied Europe, a silk parachute was the ultimate windfall. If a paratrooper drifted off course and landed in a French field, the local resistance would risk their lives to hide him, but they would also carefully scavenge every inch of the parachute. A single military-grade parachute cost the U.S. government approximately $200 in 1942, roughly $3,800 today, but on the European black market, its value was infinite. The fabric from a single shoot could be traded for months of food or sewn into dozens of wedding dresses and shirts for an entire village. In the ruins of Berlin and the cafes of Paris, parachute silk became the ultimate medium of exchange, a tangible asset that held its value as national currencies collapsed under the weight of hyperinflation. Back in the United States, the government launched the Silk for Victories campaign. They asked American women to donate their old silk stockings and dresses to be recycled into powder bags for naval guns. It took approximately 2,000 recycled silk stockings to create a single powder bag for a heavy 16-inch naval gun. Silk was the only material that burned completely and left no residue. If a bag left even a single spark behind in the breach, the next charge would explode prematurely, destroying the ship and its crew. The wealth thread was literally the only thing standing between a successful broadside and a catastrophic naval disaster. But the most fascinating economic and tactical legacy of this chapter is the maps of the resistance. Because silk is quiet, it doesn't rustle like paper, durable, and can be soaked in water without falling apart, British and American intelligence services printed millions of escape maps on silk squares. Between 1940 and 1945, British MI9 produced over 3.5 million of these silk maps. These were sewn into the linings of pilots' jackets or hidden inside the heels of boots. A pilot shot down over the Balkans carried a piece of the wealth thread that was his only hope for survival, a microscopic, high-definition guide to freedom. However, this absolute dependency on a biological thread controlled by an enemy power terrified the American industrial complex. It sparked a desperate, multi-billion-dollar R&D race. The U.S. government eventually issued a $100 million urgent grant to the DuPont Corporation, the equivalent of nearly $2 billion today, to accelerate the production of silk-like synthetics. This investment was a direct response to the silk blockade imposed by the war. The military's need for silk was the catalyst for the invention of the world's first true silk killer. The strategic fiber era proved that silk's value was not just an aesthetic construct of the elite, it was a fundamental physical property that humans had yet to replicate in a laboratory. By the time the war ended in 1945, the wealth thread had saved tens of thousands of lives, but its 5,000-year monopoly was shattered. The paratrooper falling through the clouds of Normandy represented the last great act of the natural silk age. The fiber had won the war, but it had also birthed the synthetic shadow, the chemical revolution, that would soon plunge the natural silk market into a permanent, niche decline. The thread that had once built empires was now being replaced by the test tube. For 5,000 years, the wealth thread was governed by a biological master, the Bombyx Mori. Every empire in this narrative, from the Han dynasty to the Sun King, was tethered to the life cycle of a moth and the growth of a mulberry tree. But in the 1930s, inside the sterile, high-pressure laboratories of the DuPont Corporation in Delaware, that ancient tether was finally severed. This is the story of the birth of nylon, the first true silk killer, and the moment the natural monopoly of the silkworm collapsed under the weight of industrial chemistry. The quest for artificial silk had been the holy grail of the 19th century, but early attempts like rayon were essentially semisynthetics that still relied on cellulose from wood pulp. DuPont wanted something deeper, a fiber built from the atom up. They hired a brilliant, tragic chemist named Wallace Carruthers, giving him a virtually unlimited budget to explore the world of polymers. Carruthers wasn't looking for a fabric, he was looking for a mathematical structure. On February 28, 1935, his team succeeded in creating Fiber 66. Synthesized from coal, water, and air, it was the world's first fully synthetic fiber. It was nylon. The financial implications of this discovery were seismic. DuPont invested $27 million in the development and commercialization of nylon before a single pair of stockings was ever sold. In modern purchasing power, this represented a $600 million R&D gamble, nearly 10% of the company's total valuation at the time, an unprecedented bet on a single molecule. DuPont's leadership knew that if they could replicate the properties of the wealth thread in a lab, they would own the market that China and Japan had dominated for millennia. They branded it as being as strong as steel, as fine as a spider's web. Unlike silk, it didn't require an army of peasants, a specific climate, or the delicate health of a larva. It was the ultimate scalable asset, a product of pure human intellect and industrial might. When nylon stockings finally hit the market on May 15, 1940, known as N-Day, the economic reaction was a frenzy that mirrored the ancient silk-crazed Rome. In New York City alone, 72,000 pairs were sold in the first 8 hours. On that single day of national sales, 5 million pairs of stockings were purchased across America, generating over $6 million in revenue within 24 hours. Within the first year, DuPont captured 30% of the hosiery market, a sector that had been the lifeblood of the Japanese economy. The wealth thread was being rerouted from the mulberry groves of Asia to the chemical vats of New Jersey. The impact on Japan was catastrophic. In the late 1930s, silk exports accounted for nearly 40% of Japan's total export value, and the United States was their primary customer. Nylon didn't just compete with silk, it devalued it with the efficiency of a guillotine. The rise of this synthetic shadow contributed to a 50% drop in Japanese silk export revenue between 1930 and 1940, severely destabilizing the yen and pushing the nation toward a more aggressive, militarized posture. As the price of nylon plummeted due to industrial mass production, dropping from $4 a pound to $1.50 within a few years, the natural silk market entered a terminal decline. The silk price floor collapsed. Natural raw silk fell from a high of $30 per pound in the 1920s to less than $3 per pound post-nylon, a 90% loss in value density. During World War II, nylon was diverted almost entirely to the military for parachutes and cordage. But the synthetic shadow had already changed the global psychology of value. By 1941, DuPont was producing 12 million pounds of nylon annually, a volume that would have required the labor of over 25 billion silkworms. This was a level of productivity that biological systems simply could not match. After the war, when natural silk attempted to return to the market, it found itself relegated to a niche luxury. By 1950, natural silk accounted for less than 1% of the global fiber market, a staggering collapse for a commodity that had ruled global trade for 3,000 years. Nylon had replaced silk in 90% of all hosiery and lingerie production in the United States. The birth of nylon also marked the birth of the environmental debt of the wealth thread. While natural silk is biodegradable and part of a carbon sequestering cycle, nylon is a petroleum product. The synthetic shadow brought with it the permanence of plastic. The wealth was now being extracted from the Earth's crust rather than grown on its surface. DuPont's success created a new chemical wealth thread, one that built the modern world of fast fashion and disposable luxury, but at a cost that the silkworm never imposed. The thread was no longer part of the Earth's breath, it was a permanent addition to its soil. Wallace Carothers never lived to see the full extent of his revolution. He took his own life shortly after the invention, struggling with depression and never realizing he had fundamentally replaced a biological secret with a chemical formula. He had effectively ended the ancient world of trade. He ensured that the wealth thread would no longer be found on a leaf, but in a test tube. The age of the moth was over, the age of the polymer had begun. The world had traded the liquid gold of nature for the liquid coal of the laboratory, forever changing the meaning of luxury. The wealth thread began as a biological secret in a Neolithic hut and ended as a digital blueprint for the modern world. While the mid-20th century synthetic shadow predicted the total extinction of the natural silk industry, believing that once the chemical formula for nylon was mastered, the silkworm would become a museum relic, history took a different turn. Today, the global silk market is a thriving $15 billion to $20 billion annual industry, growing at a steady rate of 7% per year. This resilience is born from a modern economic paradox. The more we surround ourselves with cheap, mass-produced petroleum synthetics, the more the natural silk fiber accrues value as the ultimate store of authentic biological luxury. The eternal shimmer is not just an aesthetic quality, it is a $15 billion hedge against the artificiality of the modern age. To understand the enduring financial power of silk, we must look at its unique physics. Silk is not merely a thread, it is a structural prism. Unlike the circular, smooth surface of nylon or polyester, the silk fiber is triangular. When light hits a silk tie or a Hermes scarf, it doesn't just bounce off, it enters the fiber, refracts, and scatters at different angles. This creates a visual depth and a specific internal glow that chemical laboratories have found impossible to replicate with perfect fidelity. In the world of high finance and the global elite, this shimmer serves as a high-fidelity signal. It tells the observer that the wearer possesses the capital to afford a material that cannot be faked by a machine. This signal value is why a single Hermes silk scarf can sell for approximately $500, even though the raw silk content is worth roughly $5. This represents a 100x markup based purely on the pattern of thought and the prestige of the natural prism. In the 21st century, the wealth thread has also evolved into a high-performance biomaterial, moving from the runway into the high-margin world of medical technology. Because silk is biocompatible, scientists are now using silk scaffolds to regrow human bone and skin, creating a sector where medical-grade silk has a value density 20,000% higher than standard textile silk. A single gram of this specialized recombinant silk can cost over $1,000, far exceeding the price of gold. The thread that once clothed emperors is now being woven into the very bodies of the elite to extend human life. This modern application ensures that the demand for the thread remains decoupled from the whims of fashion, anchoring its value in the essential industry of human longevity. The geography of the thread has also come full circle, returning to its origins. China, the original guardian of the secret, has reclaimed its throne by producing nearly 80% of the world's raw silk. This dominance allows China to set the global silk benchmark, effectively controlling the cost of luxury for every major European fashion house. The Chinese government's new Silk Road, Belt and Road Initiative, a $1 trillion geopolitical project, is a testament to the thread's enduring legacy. It is the only material in history significant enough to serve as the brand for the most ambitious infrastructure project in human history. China understands that the wealth thread is not just an export, it is a symbol of 5 millennia of continuous economic and cultural leverage. Furthermore, the eternal shimmer now carries a green premium. In an era of environmental crisis, natural silk has rebranded itself as the carbon-neutral luxury. While nylon and polyester are petroleum products that sit in landfills for centuries, a hectare of mulberry trees can sequester up to 20 tons of CO2 per year, making silk one of the most carbon-efficient luxury assets on the planet. This environmental ROI has allowed the wealth thread to survive the fast fashion backlash. However, the labor-to-luxury ratio remains steep. Producing 1 kilogram of raw silk today still requires 3,000 silkworms consuming 104 kilograms of mulberry leaves. This inherent difficulty of production creates a permanent supply flaw that keeps the price of silk high, preventing it from ever being commoditized like cotton or plastic. As we look towards the future, the wealth thread is entering its designer biology phase. Silicon Valley startups are currently attracting over $1 billion in annual venture capital to gene-edit silkworms to produce spider silk, a material 5 times stronger than steel. This is the marriage of the ancient biological secret with modern CRISPR technology. We are no longer just harvesting the thread, we are rewriting its code to create the next trillion-dollar material. The journey of the wealth thread, from Empress Leisu's teacup to the bioreactors of today, proves that as long as humanity craves the rare and the beautiful, this fiber will remain our most vital currency. It is the shimmer that survived the machine, the liquid gold that never fades, and the silent architect of the world's wealth. Thank you for listening to our deep dive into silk, and we hope you've gained some new insights. If you enjoyed this journey, please hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Thanks again, and we'll catch up next Thursday to look into the first central banks.